Good afternoon and welcome to EntryPoint, where we take a deep dive into the latest entries from Encyclopedia Virginia with the contributors who wrote them. I'm Patty Miller. I'm the managing editor of Encyclopedia Virginia, and I'm really pleased to be hosting today's panel on the Oyster King of New York. For those of you who aren't familiar with Encyclopedia Virginia, we are a free, reliable multimedia resource that tells the inclusive history of Virginia for anyone who is interested in learning how the past informs the present. And I would like to just cover a couple housekeeping issues before we get started today. Please share your questions in the Q&A tab once we finish hearing from our speakers. And also the event does have closed captioning that you can set at the bottom of your screen on your Zoom controls. Now, I'm so pleased to introduce today's guests. Joanne Hyppolite is the supervisory curator of the African Diaspora at the National Museum of African American History and Culture and the author of our new entry on Thomas Downing, the Oyster King of New York. I will drop a link to that in the chat for anyone who wants to take a look at the full entry, which I think you'll find is really fascinating. And we also have with us today Dave Schulte, who is the regional oceanographer for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, the Norfolk District, and the author of a fascinating article on the history of the Virginia oyster fishery that we'll be hearing about a little bit later. First, we're going to hear from Joanne, who's going to tell us about Thomas Downing and his remarkable life.
Thank you, Patty, and welcome everyone. I'm really excited to be here with you all today to share my passion for Thomas Downing, which you'll see certainly in the Encyclopedia of Virginia entry, but I hope I'm also going to be able to communicate that with you in this presentation. I'm going to share my screen. Give me just a couple of seconds to get it all up and ready for you, and then I'll start. And just give me can you all see that without any problem right now? Is that a yes, Patty? Everybody can see the screen? Yeah. Yes, good to go. Great. Great. So right there, you'll see on the screen, there is a image of Thomas Downing. And it's an image that comes from the Museum of Food and Drinks exhibition last year called African America Making the Nation's Table. One of the things that I do is I pay attention to where Downing shows up in other exhibitions, because the way that I learned about him myself was from an exhibition. In 2005, New York City had done their world famous exhibition on slavery in New York. And they had featured Downing in it, particularly as a businessman. As an African American man who did very, very well as an entrepreneur in New York City. And then last year, there was an exhibition called African America Making the Nation's Table, which was also on display in New York. And as part of that, they created a quilt block, a part of a bigger quilt. But one of the quilt blocks featured Downing, and that's what you see pictured on the screen here. The larger quilt is called a legacy quilt, and it honors the countless African Americans in the food and drink industry who have laid the foundation for American cuisine. So Downing's presence on the quilt, along with dozens of others, really speaks to him as someone who's often remembered for his achievements and his notable success as a culinary entrepreneur. Great. So I mentioned that one of the ways I got to know Downing was through an exhibition. I had become the curator for the African diaspora at the National Museum of African American History and Culture in 2014. And I was working on curating this exhibition that you see here on the screen called Cultural Expressions. Cultural Expressions looks at 5 ways in which African Americans, really all Black people, all people in general, express cultures. And the 5 of many ways in which they express cultures. So there are sections in the exhibition like artistry. There are sections related to style. There are sections related to language. And there's a great section called Food, Culture, and Cuisine. And I'm going to show you what that section looks like on the next slide. So this is the Food, Culture, and Cuisine section of the exhibition. And as you can see there in the middle, we've prominently featured an oyster story. What was happening when I was curating the Cultural Expressions Food, Culture, and Cuisine section is we were trying to look around for diverse stories about Black people and their foodways. There's too much of a stereotype out there that African Americans only eat soul food, and that all African Americans existed from the agricultural South, and so their foodways are linked and associated with that. We really wanted to break up that idea because, of course, African Americans, depending on where their parents from, depending on where they lived in different parts of the country, would have had very different representations of food on their table and would have been participating in the culinary scene of their regions as well. One of the things we do know across the country is that African Americans were high percentage of them were in the culinary industry. They were driving chuck wagons in the West, and serving the food. They were in hotels in the North, cooking food in the back. They were in presidential kitchens, and then of course they were throughout the American South, also in kitchens as well. And what they would have cooked, depending on where they lived and who they worked for, would have been vastly different. And it wouldn't have been all soul food. So we were looking for a story that would tell us something, educate people a little bit about the diversity. And we landed on, focusing on New Orleans cuisine, which is there represented on the left with the plate of red beans and rice. There's the agricultural South is also represented down here with the greens pot. We talk about greens. And then we told the story of oysters, right? And now, unless you live in some place like a coastal Florida region or in the Chesapeake Bay region, you may not know that African Americans have had this long connection and association with oysters. And we represented that different ways. We chose to focus on this picture on the screen. You'll see pictures here at the top of Chesapeake oyster shuckers on the Maryland shore from 1891. Down to the right of the picture of Downing here, you'll see African Americans gathering oysters at Florida's Apalachicola Bay in 1895. And this tiny picture, which you can't possibly see here, are Delaware Bay oyster shuckers from the early 1900s. We talk in this section about the booming appetite for saltwater shellfish, particularly during the 1800s and 1900s, and the heavy presence of African Americans throughout all phases of the industry that developed, right, to meet the demand for this appetite. So along the East Coast, you found African Americans working as hired schooners, working on schooners as hired captains, as operators, as the crew on these schooners as well. They hogged and gathered oysters along the shore. They planted and harvested and shucked them for oyster companies. And you also found them as vendors, peddling oysters on the city streets, serving them up raw or fried or stewed, depending on that. What we wanted to capture with this section, of course, was their heavy involvement, Black people's heavy involvement in the oyster trade from sea to table. And I think we captured that great in three-dimensional ways by, also showcasing some oyster implements here, like we have the oyster dining forks, we have the cans here, we have some oyster shucking devices and a basket as well. But we also have these three gentlemen represented here, only one of whom is Thomas Downing. The other two men, to the far left is Charles H. Anderson, owner of Anderson Fish and Oyster Company in Jacksonville, Florida from the early 1800s. And we have Roscoe Lee Dixon, owner of Roscoe's Oyster House in Astoria, Oregon. And that picture is from 1878 to 1888. And the most well-known of all of them is the third man, of course, pictured here, and that is New York Oyster House owner Thomas Downing, pictured in an image that we think comes from the 1860s. Move my slide. Here we go. So who was Thomas Downing? Where did he come from? And how did he get to be the Oyster King of New York? So Downing was born free on Chincoteague Island in Virginia. The little arrow here really marks where Chincoteague Island is. His parents had been enslaved to a major Virginia landowner named Captain John Downing. We don't know much about Downing's parents. There isn't enough records about where they themselves were born, where they themselves grew up, but we do know that at some point they were a married couple belonging to Captain John Downing. Captain John Downing, after converting to the Methodist Christian faith, actually ended up freeing all of his slaves, including Downing's parents. His parents then went on to purchase land on Chickadee Island, and because this is where he grew up, surrounded by water, right? He grew up harvesting shellfish and other maritime, harvesting shell and participating in other maritime activities because that was his environment, his geographical environment. As a young man, we know that he left his island home during the War of 1812. It's very unclear whether he actually signed up to join the war or whether he just followed them. We couldn't find a military record to substantiate that, but we know that he is moving out of that area around that time. And the next place he pops up is in Philadelphia, where we know he spent 7 years. And it's there that he marries Rebecca West. And then the two of them decide at some point to move to New York. And we find in 1819. So Downing arrives in New York during a period when there's a tremendous amount of change occurring for African Americans. Just 2 years prior, in 1817, the New York legislature had set the stage for the complete abolition of slavery. So it's important to know that in 1817, they decide that all remaining people who are slaves, Black people who are enslaved in the state, will be free as of July 4th, 1827. So they're setting this, this time period for when slavery will end. You can imagine what was going on during those that period of time, those 20 years, as people are preparing for themselves to be free and also preparing to release their enslaved people into other activities in their lives that they can take place. Ostensibly, this offered the promise of a number of new opportunities for Black people in the state, particularly as it relates to employment, right? You're suddenly going to be paid for the work that you do. You can choose to leave the employment you're on and move on to other places. So there's a considerable amount of promise during this period of time when Downing and his wife show up. We know that in 1819, Thomas Downing is showing up in the New York census as listing himself already as an oysterman. But we also know that that wasn't the only thing that he did. He's also employed in other jobs. He's working at the Bunker House Hotel. In the early 1820s, he held multiple occupations, sometimes as a whitewasher and sometimes as a house cleaner, and sometimes again as an oysterman running his own stand. But by 1825, Downing has built up enough savings to be able to lease the basement of a property on 5 Broad Street in New York City's financial district. And there he opens up an oyster refectory, which is also known as an oyster cellar. Now, oyster refectories are a type of underground eating and drinking establishment that caters mainly to, sorry about that, Joe, that caters mainly to white clienteles. And to give you a little context of why oyster refectories are starting to show up in New York, oysters were abundant and inexpensive in New York City during that period of time. They were enjoyed by all classes. To quote Mark Krolaski, who wrote the wonderful book, The Big Oyster, they were also incredibly abundant in New York. And as Mark Krolaski writes, quote, the estuary of the lower Hudson had 350 square miles of oyster beds. The beds were found along the shore of Brooklyn and Queens, in Jamaica Bay, in the East River, on all shores of Manhattan, tucked into the many coves of a coastline much more jagged than it has been, much more jagged than it's become today because of landfills. Oyster beds also prospered along the Hudson as far as up as Ossining, and along the Jersey shore down to Keyport in the Keyport, Raritan, and Hackensack rivers, on many reefs surrounding Staten Island, City Island, Liberty Island, and Ellis Island. The Dutch called Ellis Island and Liberty Island Little Oyster Island and the Great Oyster Island because of the sprawling natural oyster beds that surrounded them. According to the estimates of some biologists, New York harbor contained fully half of the world's oysters. So you can see from that quote, oysters being this incredibly enterprise, this availability of them was not to be exceeded in many other places. And people are taking advantage of that to harvest them, to sell them on the streets, to open up restaurants that feature them. And that's why you see oyster cellars beginning to pop up in New York as early as 1873. One of the other interesting features about oyster cellars is that many of them were operated by Black men. So Downing isn't the only Black person operating an oyster cellar. Along Broad Street, there were other Black men who also opened up these refectories. And an oyster cellar during that period of time really would be considered a dive, you know? They were shady and dingy. They had dim lighting and low security. Oftentimes they were associated with, if there were ladies in there, the ladies in there were prostitutes. So these are the kind of spaces that are opening up early on as oyster cellars. And the first kind of space that Downing opens. That changes very quickly for him. One of the other things to note about New York during this period of time, that fine dining restaurants in New York were really limited before the 1820s. Restaurants weren't a culture. There wasn't a culture of restaurants and fine dining in the country yet. And in fact, when you had people visiting, when you had important guests, most of the places that you'd hosted them for a meal was in a private home. There were these inns and other lodgings that served basic travelers' needs, and there were also taverns that offered casual dining for serious drinkers. But fine dining really had not yet emerged yet in the city, and it was a problem because New York was a popular visiting destination for Europeans and American dignitaries, for celebrities all over the country, and for members of the upper class. So the city needs to build up a dining culture. And one of the people who steps up to the plate and creates a space for that is Thomas Downing himself. Downing's establishment, which started humbly in 1819, by 1835 has evolved into the two spaces next door, and he's implemented a large open dining space. It's described as being elegantly decorated and including having fine damask curtains, mirrors, and a chandelier, white tablecloths, the kind of things you would see when you're dining at a fine restaurant today. In 1845, the New York Tribune actually lists Downing's Oyster House as one of the earliest of 13 pioneer eating houses during that period of time. It's the only one that's Black owned. Because of its location, Downing's Oyster House drew in wealthy as well as many influential white men who came to dine there. It's important to note that dining was segregated in New York during that period of time. So Downing only served a white clientele at his oyster house. That white clientele, because of where it was located, included merchants and bankers who were associated with Wall Street and the financial district. It included influential newspaper men. And some of these people who Downing got to know as a result of them being clients of his, patrons of his hotel, were George Templeton Strong, and the former New York City Mayor, Philip Hone. He was friends with the New York Herald owner, James Gordon Bennett. So he himself started to amass a lot of influence by knowing these people and becoming friends with them. And we know a lot of what we know about Downing today because they also write about him. We go back to their writings about him, and they're mentioning going to Downing's and eating. They're mentioning him catering influential events. Downing's menu was expansive. He included offerings such as oysters shaved on the gridiron over oak shavings, as well as scalloped oysters, oyster pie, turkey stuffed with oysters, and terrapin, another 19th century delicacy. The other thing that Downing promised and did as part of his work was that he delivered food to all parts of the city, including Brooklyn and Jersey City. You know, today, these days, when I'm visiting, like I'm visiting family now, you just saw my aunt behind me a little while ago. She when I want to go get something to eat, I Google on my phone food near me, right? And we can go to Uber Eats or Grubhub, and someone will come and deliver something to us. I mean, he was way ahead of his time that he was doing this back in the 1800s. I mean, if you all remember, even before Grubhubs and Uber Eats came around, if you were going to get food delivered, there had to be a small radius, right? That you could Someone would tell you if you weren't, a few miles away from the location, they weren't going to deliver. And that's if the restaurant actually offered delivery. But here's Downing in the early 1800s offering delivery to many parts of the city. Through stellar service and his relationships with prominent individuals, Downing was quickly able to build a name for himself. Throughout the press, you see newspaper articles mentioning him and pronouncing him things like a celebrated oyster vendor. They call him the Great Oysterman, and they also mention him as the well-known colored caterer and oysterman. And he's also promoting himself through the newspaper. He's marketing himself and his products in newspapers like the New York Evening Post, the New York Herald, and the New York Tribune throughout the 1830s and the 1840s. And in his ads, he's quite the promoter. He emphasizes the superiority of his product, which is said to be had in their prime, and of the better stock of oysters, and with a quality that you can experience through the delicacy of flavor. And he says that his oysters cannot be beaten compared to everyone else's. He challenges everyone to come to Downing's Oyster House, to come and to taste and to see the difference between his oysters and those others that can be had at restaurants throughout the city. And lastly, he promotes his ability to meet supply promptly. He says, I will send them out for suppers, together with oysters and other game, to gentlemen's private rooms or families at the shortest notice. So he's not just promising service, he's promising fast service. This is quite incredible. And to imagine to be able to live up to those promises, he would have to have done that. We're not in the age of reviews in the 18, like Google reviews or Yelp reviews in the 1800s, but we do have word of mouth. And if his patrons are saying that he's not living up to his service, they would have known about it and they would have shared that information with each other. Downing was not only serving up oysters and oysters Downing, also he was also very heavily involved in catering. It was another way that he grew his financial enterprises. Probably his most famous event catered was the Boz Ball, which was held in honor of visiting celebrity writer Charles Dickens. It was considered the most sophisticated event of the season. There were 2,500 people that attended, and apparently over 25,000 oysters were consumed. He also catered for the opening of steamship companies. He also exported goods. So what you see on the left here is an oyster jar in which Downing has encapsulated, stored pickled oysters, right? And you can see it has 5 Broadway, New York on the street, so it has its address as well. And pickling oysters was one way to preserve them, and he would ship fresh and pickled oysters from the United States internationally to places like France, the West Indies, and to England. At one point he sold he sent a jar of these oysters to Queen Victoria, and in return she gifted him with a gold chronometer watch. There was an expatriate in Paris named Colonel Herman Thorne, who threw lavish Paris parties, and he was known for serving Downing's oysters, for importing them and serving them there. So because of that, Downing amasses quite a lot of wealth. By 1857, he's become one of the wealthiest Black men in New York City, if not the country. But this is not the sum total of Downing's life. He's also a major activist, a major abolitionist in New York during that period of time. Though African Americans were freed, all of them in New York, after July 4th, 1827, most African Americans living in the city during the 1800s still had to endure racial segregation, periodic episodes of racial violence, and the effects of limited economic and educational opportunities. Not everybody had it as good as Downing, and most of them really worked at a subsistence and a lower class level. But Downing's success as an entrepreneur afforded him opportunities that most African Americans did not have. Even though he's very much a member of the Black elite by the 1830s, he's able to use his finances to do things like educate his son Peter in Paris. All of his 5 children attend the African Free School with a number of other children of the Black elite. But Downing, like other members of the Black elite during that period of time, understood that their fate was linked to that of all Black people, not just in New York, but also in the country. And regardless of if they were enslaved or not, or whether they were poor or free or rich, they all still suffered the indignities of white supremacist ideologies and systemic racism. So Downing used his position to advocate. And when we say advocate, he's not the kind of person that you're going to find a lot of speeches from, like a Frederick Douglass would have done during that period of time. But you see him on the records of a number of influential organizations. And you also see newspaper articles of him protesting some of the ways in which African Americans are restricted in the city. So in 1830, we see Thomas Downing serving as a delegate to the first annual convention for the improvement of the free people of color. So they're looking to improve the life for all free people in the country. We also see him between 1833 and 1836 become one of the founding members of the New York City Anti-Slavery Society. And there's been lots of articles that have been published reporting that the basements of his oyster house were actually a stop on the Underground Railroad. In 1838, Thomas Downing helps organize a celebration in New York to celebrate the end of slavery in the British West Indies. So remember, slavery was across the globe during this period of time, and every time one part of slavery fell in one country, Black people celebrated around the globe to share their happiness at that news. He also joined the benevolent organizations such as the New York African Society for Mutual Relief, which helped to provide care for Black New Yorkers who were sick, impoverished, or widowed. And then individually, he's mounting his own protests and his own demonstrations. We know that in 1840 and in 1855, he protests having to sit in the segregated section of the local transportation, the local New York transportation, these segregated rail cars. During the first incident, we know he's beaten and injured after refusing to exit that car. The case goes to court, and that's why we know about it. It's written up very well in the court cases in the newspapers during that period of time. We also know in 1855 he also refuses to exit a 6th Avenue Railroad trolley car, and this time he actually successfully completes his rides because a crowd of supporters actually white supporters actually back him up, and they help push the rail car forward when they hear that how can they be, ejecting Thomas Downing, this wonderful, venerable man who has such a wonderful reputation in this country, in the city. And then in 1857, one of the things that happens in 1857, across the country is the landmark, infamous Dred Scott decision, and the Dred Scott decision, right, decides that all people of African ancestry, whether they're slave or free, could never become citizens of the United States, and therefore they're not allowed to sue in federal court. So this was a huge decision that had reverberations around the country, particularly for someone like Downing, who needs to sometimes sue people because they have not paid his bills, right? Or because he has his right as a Black man and citizen to bring something before court as a free Black man. But you see him protesting the Dred Scott decision when he himself is actually being sued in court over a debt. So someone's taken him to court for money that he owes them. He refuses to be sworn in on the grounds that the Supreme Court had said Black people enjoyed no rights as citizens. So he says, I can't participate in this trial. I'm not even a citizen. And the judge, just ignores that and says that Downing can be a citizen just for the purpose of this trial alone. So it's quite a funny way of getting around what was the law at the time. We also know that Downing also joined the fight to restore the right to vote to Black men in New York. Most Black men had been effectively disenfranchised in 1821 when the new Constitution required that if Black men could vote, they would have to own at least $250 worth of property and be state residents in the state for at least 3 years. This was not a restriction they placed on white residents of the city. There were no property requirements if white men wanted to vote, and they were only required to have been in the city a year. Though ultimately unsuccessful, Downing participated in campaign meetings, helped petition efforts, and in 1839 served as vice president of the New York Association for the Political Evaluation and Improvement of Colored People. Ultimately unsuccessful because it isn't until the 15th Amendment in 1870 that we actually see all Black people get the right to vote in the country. Though depending on where you are, you can still be confined or restricted from that. Right. So Downing lives quite a long time, until the age of 75. He passes away on April 10th, 1866. But we know that in 1863, just 3 years early, he's actually forced to close his Broad Street property because the lease, although he's had this lease for over 30 years, it's now changing hands. The owner wants to sell the building and he can't hold on to the property. For Showtime, Downing operates an eatery in the Merchants Exchange building because his friends very much want him to keep a place, his white patrons and friends, but it doesn't last for very long. By then, he has slowed down quite a bit, and his son is beginning to take over most of his enterprises. 3 years later, we know that he's passed away. He's on April 10th, 1866. There's notes all over in the newspapers about his passing. We know that his funeral is attended by many influential people, both black and white. We know that the New York Chamber of Commerce closed on the day of his funeral in honor of their respect for him. As his son George Downing writes in an epigraph on him that's published several years later, his coffin was followed by a cortege of his fellow citizens from all classes, which spoke of the universal esteem of which he was held. And pictured in this image to the left here is a picture of his eldest son, George Downing. On a side note, let me just say one thing. Downing's name was Thomas George Downing. His son's name was George Thomas Downing. And that's caused for quite a lot of confusion out there on the internet when you're looking up and want to understand the differences between the two men. Many people have confused their histories and confused the work that each one of them did. And part of the reason for that confusion is because George Downing, the son, really did follow in his father's footsteps. He himself was an entrepreneur. He built hotels. He also catered for many events. He opened up restaurants. By the age of 26, his father is able to set him up in business at 690 Broad Street in a business which is called George T. Downing, Confectioner and Caterer, which was also frequented by the New York elite. He expands into opening hotels in Providence, in Newport, Rhode Island. And by 1855, he probably has one of the best known hotels, the Seagirt House. He becomes known not for oysters, but for ices and creams, actually, as a confectioner. He earns a worldwide reputation for it. And then the other thing that George Downing George the son is known for is that he runs the refectory. I remember, again, that word for eating houses, the refectory for the House of Representatives in Washington, D.C. for over 12 years. So you see the way the influence his father had on him, and you see the way he's able to extend the legacy of his father through this work and through his own enterprises. And that is the end of my presentation on Thomas Downing. I look forward to getting your questions and the next part of the program after our next speaker.
Thank you so much, Joanne. Just a really fascinating story, and really gets to something that we highlight in a number of entries in Encyclopedia Virginia, which is just how intimately involved African Americans were in the seafood industry in the entire Chesapeake Bay region for so long. I'm going to put a link in the chat to our entry on enslaved fishermen and mariners in Virginia, which really covers the period from very early in the colonial history of Virginia through to the Civil War. And really the entire Chesapeake Bay seafood industry was African American largely. Most of them were enslaved African Americans. Some were quasi-independent boat captains who were allowed to work for someone and keep a share of their earnings. And some, like Thomas Downing, eventually left Virginia and went to places where they could be entrepreneurs and be free. But there really is such a close association. After the Civil War, many African Americans make their living in the industry. But then we see a period where, despite this really vibrant industry, because of overfishing, because of a number of factors, the oyster fishery crashes in Virginia. So Dave is just going to give us a very brief overview of the history of the oyster fishery, how it kind of went from boom to bust, and where are we at now, Dave, with the oyster fishery in 2023, all these years after Thomas Downing first made such a success of himself with oysters. I think you're on mute. Oh, no, you're off. There you go. There you
Okay.
go. There you are, Dave. Sorry.
Okay. As part of my PhD dissertation, which I'm just wrapping up now on Chesapeake Bay oyster restoration, I thought that a good start would be to take a look at the history of the fishery in order to figure out how to restore it. So I did a lot of extensive research on it, and it was an interesting presentation for me because it filled in a few gaps of my knowledge in what happened before the peak of the fishery. So, just to get started, at the time uh, we're talking about here, which is basically the pre-peak era of the fishery, which occurred in the 1880s, a lot of things happened. One was New England oyster fishers came down to the Chesapeake Bay around 1810 and started to fish here because their own reefs were being depleted up in New York. And it may be one of the reasons he moved up there was to seize opportunities up there. Um, in return for their direct fishing for New England, I know that oyster seed began to get shipped up into that region, and it is quite possible he was directly involved in that. One thing that makes me believe that is because the oysters he shipped over to Queen Victoria. I know at the time oysters in the Lynnhaven River were called Lynnhaven Fancies, and they were the most valuable oyster in probably the United States at the time. And I'm guessing that he probably had access to those and might have shipped those over. It'd be a very interesting thing to find to firm out, but I don't think we'll be able to do it. But anyway, to continue, a lot happened in the fishery. It really started to get active probably around the 1820s. And that was when the first oyster harvest in Virginia approached about 2 million bushels. One of the main things that was holding it back were, well, there's two. One was lack of transportation for the oysters throughout the United States, and the other one was preservation techniques. And what happened was canning and other preservation techniques started to gain steam around 1840, and rail lines linked the Chesapeake Bay to the rest of the country in the 1850s. So those two things really started to explode the oyster fishery, which went from just over 2 million bushels in the 1860s to over 7 million bushels in the 1880s. And at that point, they weren't really fishing them sustainably. And at the time, you know, scientists, there were really no one to look at it and no real management. It was basically for all intents and purposes, a free for all. State fishery management started to get involved in it really after the peak occurred in around 1890. And management actions were very limited prior to that. Mainly what they did were actions like prevent dredgers from going into shallow waters. The oyster dredges did a lot more damage to the reefs than the hand tongs. And just to describe what a dredge is it's about 6 to 8 feet long, big metal basket with teeth on it that the boat drags across the bottom, and it has a bag on the back and scoops up the oysters and everything else as it's dragged along. Whereas the hand tongs are operated on an individual basis. One fisherman, one pair of hand tongs. They're basically a giant double-handed rake, and you open and close them just like a big scissors. I've used them, and I can vouch for that. That would be a tough way to make a living. So after the peak, what happens eventually in the 1920s is a crash of the wild oyster fishery. At that point, the state fishery managers start putting more effort into the public leasehold oyster fishery, and this is where people are renting renting areas of the bottom and planting oysters that they are buying from growers that are transporting seed oysters from the James River. These are baby oysters from really high recruitment areas in the James River. They're catching those and selling them to the leaseholders, who are then growing them out to market. So that aspect of the fishery started to take over around 1820. And The fishery kind of chugged along for a couple of decades after that. But remember, the wild fishery is still collapsed. It's just that the leasehold fishery has kind of taken its place. So for your consumer of oysters, they don't really notice the difference. So unfortunately, what happens in the 1940s is the first big disease outbreak of a disease. It's called dermo, and it was responsible for 3 outbreaks over the years. And the most recent one in the 1980s is the one that really collapsed the oyster fishery in the Chesapeake Bay. It caused over 90% oyster mortalities, but before they would reach market size. So it just ruined everything basically. And I got involved personally in oyster restoration right at basically the rock bottom of the oyster fishery around the year 2000, where the harvest was like a fraction of 1% of the historic peak. And since then, a couple things have happened, all good news. One was the oysters have started to develop disease resistance. We first started to see it around the late 2005, 2010 time period, and it's slowly getting better. And we have vastly increased our restoration efforts, and they are actually proving to be quite effective. And we're actually in position to achieve our Baywide restoration goal of restoring oyster populations to 10 tributary rivers by 2025. And that's in keeping with an executive order from the Obama administration, which set that goal for us about 10 years ago. So the good news is the oysters are definitely on a comeback, and the wild harvest is up. It's, I think, around 300 to 400,000 bushels a year out of Virginia, which is still it's a fraction of what it used to be at the peak, but it's certainly much, much higher than it was in the late 1980s through the early 2000s. So that's where we're at with oysters right now. And I'll answer any questions that you have related to that.
Thank you, Dave. That is really good news. And it's good news to see that whole, as we said, there was a whole culture built around that. So it is really good news to see that whole culture come back, because it is such a historic part of the entire Bay region. And we do have a question from someone does anyone know, either of you, has someone written a book about the treatment of Blacks on the water in Eastern Maryland and Virginia, on the fishermen, the boat owners? Joanne, are you aware of any resources like that?
None that I'm going to name off the top of my head, but I know that there are resources. In fact, if you go onto Amazon and you put Eastern Shore African Americans, you're going to see a lot of work that pops up related to the plantation during plantations on that part of the region. The other very famous African American people lived on the Eastern Shore, including Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman. So that area has been very well studied because of that. And so you see these larger books that are treating Black people on the Eastern Shore in general. But those that are focused specifically on the watering side of communities, that I know I didn't come across. I will say that doesn't mean it doesn't exist, right? And then the other thing is that there is a great fictional novel by Sarah Elizabeth Wright, who was a major Black writer during the 1950s. She's been forgotten over time, who also grew up on Maryland's Eastern Shore. She wrote this great novel called This Child's Gonna Live, about growing up on the Eastern Shore. She was the daughter of a waterman. And so that if you want to learn more from that perspective, from someone who grew up within that culture and interested in the work that she created, This Child's Gonna Live is a great resource.
And I also know, I believe there is a book forthcoming about the pathways to freedom for enslaved African Americans that were provided by the Bay, because so many, and you can read our entry on enslaved mariners and fishermen, the nature of water work is people had to have a certain amount of autonomy. And very often these enslaved, especially boat pilots, they knew the bays and the rivers better than their enslavers did. So oftentimes they could take a boat and they could skedaddle out of there, or they could sign on to work on another boat with their skills. And you often would see ads for people who had self-emancipated, and their enslavers are seeking to get them back, and they say they have water skills and they're probably passing as a free waterman. It was a very common. So I know there's I can't remember the title of it, but it sounds fascinating about that as a major freedom pathway for people. Another question, do you have any thoughts on how Downing's Oyster restaurant was able to make the shift from the dive to a fancier restaurant? As you said, with very few people, no one was doing that. So how did he do that?
Here's what I suspect. Downing spent, many years in Philadelphia, and we don't know. There's just aren't enough records of what he was doing at that time. But if you look through the history during that time, Philadelphia had major African American caterers throughout its long history. It was Robert Bogle, it was Pierre Augustin. They were really well known. They opened up their own restaurants, and they were catering major events. I can't say if he knew any of them, but the fact that they were such a substantive presence in that city during that time, and people would have known at them, and they were doing fine dining during that period of time, I think he might have had models already for what he wanted to do in New York City. And certainly after he opened his restaurant, restaurateurs talked to each other, and he would have been in touch with the people in Philadelphia and may have known that these were options for him. When he grew up in Virginia's Eastern Shore, his family was in charge of the meeting house, Downing's Meeting House, that was part of the Methodist Church there. So his family was in the business of already serving the white gentry in that community during that time, and there may have been standards that were in place that he learned from that particular period of time, and probably why he was so easily able to make friends and draw this particular class of clientele, because he knew them and was in contact with them really as a young boy.
And we have another question. What was the size of the oyster pot in the picture? Like, how big was that? Do you have a sense that you can give us? And that was for pickled oysters, is that correct?
Yeah, the ceramic jar for pickled oysters. I had to look it up. I saw it in the chat, so I was like, "Oh, let me look up in our collection." So it's actually 6 inches by 4 inches. Wait, is that 6 and 5/16 by 4 and 3/16 by 4 and 3/16? Not that big.
Yeah. It's not very big, but
6 by 4.
As Dave mentioned, the ability to pickle those and move those oysters around obviously becomes a big deal, because you can only move things, so fast. Let's see, what else do we have here? So are there aspects of Downing's life that you were not able to uncover through your research? I know that's always a frustration for historians.
Yeah, I think I remember writing you at one point saying, man, I can't stand that I can only find out about George Downing, but I can't find out about his other 5 kids. I know one passed away, but what happened to the other 4? We know that Peter went to Paris and got educated, and then what happened to Peter? So I just emailed the genealogist at the museum, and I was like, if you want to work together, let's figure out where all of Downing's descendants actually end up, not just George, the son. And I'm also frustrated by the fact that there's no really good information about his wife and what her role was in the business. Did she work in the restaurant? Was she a housewife? How did she help build up the business? Nothing is written about her in any of the articles or in the George the Son's monograph. And I just wonder what role she played in all of these enterprises, or with the family in general. Was she herself an activist? I mentioned already that Philadelphia is something that is open for a ton of research. If we could figure out what he was doing there and what he learned there, that would be incredibly important to filling in the absence that's in this history between Chincoteague Island and New York. It would be great to be able to fill that in.
Great. Dave, this is a question for you. Are the Lynnhaven River oysters still available and on the market?
After decades of not being available, they today are available. Yes, there are several aquaculture operations, and you can buy Lynnhaven fancies from them. Yeah, and I've actually eaten some, and I can vouch they're very good.
Are they good? Good. We'll have to do some additional research on that at Encyclopedia of Virginia. And then we have another question, and I know, Joanne, you have a little insight on this from the entry. She's wondering, or Robin is wondering, if Black businessmen had trouble getting paid for their services.
Yes, they did, quite a bit. Shane White, the historian, has written quite a bit on that, and he mentions Downing in his articles. So it was seminal for my understanding of what was going on. Downing sued, actually, in spite of the fact that he told people that I'm not a citizen, so I can't sue. He sued people when they didn't pay his bills, and he could do that because he had the money to do it, right? So he would take them to court for it. But there was the issue during the time in New York was that private banks were issuing the currency because the U.S. government hadn't taken over issuing currency yet. So banks would fail and certain currency would be no good anymore, or people would print false currency, right? And try to submit it for services. And that happened to Downing more than a few times. There was apparently this book that you would look through to see which currency was actually still good. And so people would, white people would actually offer bad currency to him, and he would have to tell them, right, that he could not accept it. And then there would be this confrontation, which is really about race at that point, right? That a black man telling a white man that his money is no good and he cannot eat there. And at some point, there's actually a planter from Virginia who comes down and does the same thing. There's that great story, right? Then he says, if I could only get him back down to Virginia, then he'd know that he can't talk to me this way. But he gets very little sympathy from the press at that time when the article was published, because Downing has built up such great social equity at that period of time. Is very well respected.
And that's what really comes through, that I think what is amazing about his life is that social equity he built up. As you say, when he passed away, all the businessmen followed his funeral procession. I mean, they really did hold him in high esteem, and that was a lifetime of work that he then was able to obviously pass on to his children. That social capital was not to be dismissed. Or when the other great story is about how people pushed the cable, the horse car forward when they tried to kick him off. And they thought him as one of their own because he was an entrepreneur, because he was successful, because he was hardworking. The one thing we didn't mention is that especially when he started and he was doing a lot of this grunt work himself, he was rowing out to meet the oyster boats before anybody else in the morning. He was there literally at the crack of dawn, got the best oysters, knew what the best oysters were, got them back and had them to shore before other oyster sellers had even gotten to the dock. So he really did have a lifetime of hard work and equity that he was able to cash in on in his life. Anyway, I think that's all we have time for today. I want to thank everyone for joining us, and especially Joanne and Dave. We will have this presentation posted on our YouTube channel. If anyone would like to share it, we encourage that. And we also encourage you, if you've enjoyed what you've seen today, we are doing a fall giving campaign for Encyclopedia Virginia. We are free and online. We are an educational resource, and your donation can help us stay free and online, and make sure everyone can take part in presentations like this. I'll put a link in the chat to a way you can donate to Encyclopedia Virginia. And we'd just like to thank everyone for being part of the Encyclopedia Virginia community. We really enjoy doing these events, and we'd love to be able to bring folks like Joanne and Dave to talk about their expertise with everyone. So thank you, everyone, for joining us. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks for inviting me. Bye.